All right, if I can once again have your attention, you're welcome to continue eating, but I'd like to introduce our speakers just a second so that you can listen to them instead of me. Now that the event itself is getting started, I'd like to start with the short prayer before work or study, in which Father Paul Mankowski, longtime scholar in residence at Lumen Christi Institute, would always use. So there's no need to join along if you could just listen and quietly pray as I say in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Direct, we beseech thee, O Lord, all our acts by your holy inspirations, and carry them on by your gracious assistance, that every word and work of ours may always begin from you, and by you be happily ended. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. Now it's time, the conversation. We have Ken Woodward, who will interview Dennis Turner on his new book, Dante the Theologian. Dennis Turner is the Horace Tracy Pitkin Professor of Historical Theology Emeritus at Yale University. He's the author of Dante the Theologian, Eros and Allegory, The Darkness of God, Marxism and Christianity, and also Julian the Theologian, that's not on here, as well as many articles and papers on the political and social theory in relation to Christian theology and on medieval thought, especially the traditions of mystical theology. He will be interviewed today by Ken Woodward, who received his BA from the University of Notre Dame. He edited Newsweek's religion section from 1964 until his retirement in 2002, which gave him a unique vantage point on personal acquaintance with the world's religious leaders. Ken, if I'm right, you're one of two journalists still with us who covered Vatican II on site, right? Or has the other one kicked the bucket? You're the finest living journalist who covered the Second Vatican Council. Good. In 2006, the University of Notre Dame gave him its Reverend Robert F. Griffin Award, which recognizes outstanding achievements in writing. His most recent publication is entitled Getting Religion, Faith, Culture, and Politics from the Age of Eisenhower to the Era of Obama. He's also the author of the Book of Miracles, the meaning of miracle stories in Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. The topic of the lecture today is Dante the Theologian. If you're looking for the book by Dennis Turner, it is for sale right here. You're welcome to buy it after the event. What will happen is right now, in just a second, I will call our interviewer and our interviewee to this table. I will sit back down. Ken will have a couple of introductory remarks, and then the conversation will go back and forth until about 1:15 p.m., and then we'll have 15 minutes for an audience Q&A. I will have a microphone. I'll carry it around, and you can address questions to the speakers then. If you could, please help me welcome Ken Woodward and Dennis Turner to the table.
Can you hear me all right?
Okay, good.
I want to sit a bit further away from this.
My most favored guest is leaving. She's 1 year old, and it's never too early to learn about Dante.
Does it have to be
But I'm
close?
sure she'll be back. Let me begin by saying that this book is from start to finish intellectual entertainment of a very, very high order. Part of that is owing to the evident pleasure you, Dennis, take in pursuing your arguments for understanding Dante as a theologian. Another part is owing to the arguments themselves. And yet a third part is the sound of the Academy's comfortable divisions of labor being delightfully breached. Over the centuries, I suspect there have been thousands of doctoral dissertations devoted to Dante's use of medieval theology, particularly Thomas Aquinas, in writing the Divine Comedy. But in this book, you argue for Dante himself as a theologian, and just as arresting that in the Commedia, Dante the poet and Dante the theologian are one. Now, I don't know how familiar this audience is with the Divine Comedy, but in it, Dante spends so much time talking to so many people that we're apt to forget that the overarching thrust of the epic is spiritual, moral, and certainly theological. So, to my questions. Dennis, let's focus for a moment on the relationship between poetry and theology. You write that your book offers, quote, a reading of Dante's comedy as the work of a writer who knows of a poet's need to write theology, just as he understands why, for the theologian, poetry is what you ought to find yourself having to do, at least in the end. These are pretty provocative statements. Why would a poet have a need to write theology, and why would a theologian eventually have to turn to poetry, as Dante does, to say what he or she has to say?
Well, I think I took my cue from Thomas Aquinas, who in December the 6th, 1273, he died 2 months later, by the way. In December the 6th, 273, he said to his amanuensis, the guy who wrote his stuff down for him, Reginald, after what I've seen today, I can write no more. And he stopped writing. And that, I think, is because he realized that the writing he was doing has an end. It leads to something else. In his case, to silence. And that silence becomes poetry precisely because of how the speech ends, stops. And it's that sense that poetry draws you to the end of something, end of a search, that it draws you to the end of speaking, and speaking has an end in two senses. It stops, but it has achieved something. It has, in that sense, an end, yeah, which is achieved. And it's silence. And I think that articulation of silence, that sense that silence actually is word, speaks, communicates, is something which almost for me defines the poetic in such a way that you ought to find theology doing just that. And you ought to find good writing doing just that too. And don't limit it to religious poetry. I don't think this is a religious thought. I think it's just a fundamentally human thought, which is why it has to be a religious thought. You can't have a religious thought without the essential human thoughts. That's what I'm saying. And so Dante's divine comedy, he didn't call it divine, by the way. It gets called divine in the early 16th century. He just calls it commedia.
All right,
That's
Dennis.
what life is. It's a comedy. And if you want to understand what kind of comedy it is, read my poem and make sure that you read it as poetry, because that's what it is, and that's where you have to be in order to get the point. Sorry, that was long-winded, but...
yeah, it was all abstract.
I get enthusiastic about this.
I want you to be. But on a more mundane level, poetry moves beyond denotation and even connotation. It goes beyond those forms of speech to bring in through sound, through the music of sound, the music of words, and through the images created, something that the speech of the Academy can't do. It seems to me that's also very much a part of why we read Dante and participate. You have to. If you read a poem, you have to participate in the poem, and it structures you in a way that straightforward definitional language doesn't. Most people read the Divine Comedy in school, and then usually just the Inferno, or just parts of it, and at a very young age. The structure of hell is based on the 7 deadly sins, which is plain enough, but you argue that you cannot understand the Inferno unless you also read the Purgatorio, and you can't understand the Purgatorio unless you read the Paradiso. Why is that so?
Well, you see, I don't think you could even write Inferno if you hadn't already got in mind writing Paradiso. Because Inferno makes no sense except in the scheme of things, the whole scheme of things, which includes, by the way, Purgatorio. And I'm as ecumenical as bedamned. But to be honest with you, my friends in other religious traditions who won't have doing with Purgatorio miss a hugely important trick. It's not an incidental Catholic eccentricity. There's something essential about the whole business of what dying is, what's involved in dying, that Purgatorio comes into that story. Otherwise, you've no story of death. You've just got punishment as a punishment, hell, and heaven as a reward, and nothing in between. Just an empty notion of death when everything else stops. And I can't imagine, just speaking for myself, I can't imagine going to heaven the way I am now, because I think better of heaven than it deserves a whole lot better than that. Yeah? And I wouldn't actually like it if it's just a continuation of the same damn thing. Yeah? It's got to be the better thing. And I need work to get there. Death won't hack it. Yeah? I've got to die properly. Yeah?
But Dennis,
and Purgatorio is about dying well.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book that, okay, so I'm reading through the Inferno.
Yeah.
And then I move into the Paradiso, and you talk in your book about it reevaluates the Inferno comes into a new light.
Yeah.
And then when you move from the Purgatorio to the Paradiso, the first two come into a totally different light.
Yeah.
So that there's a kind of revision that takes place. You understand more about what you've already been through when you move on to the next.
Yes, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, I think once you start reading Purgatorio, you begin to understand Inferno. I mean, the way I personally found myself understanding Inferno is to say it doesn't exist. But you have to be able to imagine its possibility and see that possibility being removed precisely by Purgatorio. That's a long story, and I don't want to go into all the details of that now, but I think it is perfectly possible to read Dante's Inferno saying, yes, he's got it absolutely right, and also say, but it doesn't happen. Because all that fear, all that reversal that is Inferno, that sense that life has become utterly pointless forever, is something which you have to be able to face, because otherwise there's one thing you really don't understand. That's called sin. And Inferno is an attempt to give a theological account of the significance of sin. This is what sin is. Yeah? And this is what sin would be forever if that's all there was. And for that reason, you can't read Inferno on its own. It has to belong within a longer story, because that's what it is. It's only part of a longer story. It cannot be the story. That's my reason for saying I don't think there is such a place, because it couldn't be the whole story. It would be a nonsense if it were the whole story for anybody.
Well,
that's another thing. And do you know, I really thought to myself before coming here, I'm not going to get into this business of whether hell exists or not. And I
invite you to do so. Go ahead.
You did. But no, do you get the point? I think it's possible to see that the talk about hell is essential. You have to be able to imagine it. Otherwise, you can't imagine what sin is. And once you imagine what sin is, you realize that can't be the whole story. But hell is saying, this is the whole story for some. Do you see what I mean? And I think one has to see it within, to use the Greek word, soteriological, part of a story of salvation, right? And that's why purgatory is essential, because purgatory is the alternative story to the story of hell. Do you see what I mean? And he's strong about purgatory. It's very strong meat. It's pretty horrific, but it is time-bound. It's not the whole story, and this sense that it's not the whole story in Inferno, it's not the whole story in Purgatorio, it is the whole story here, and you don't understand it. Here, high fantasy fails, says Dante at the end of Paradiso. Here, even powerful imagination can't get it. And my will was moved by love. That's all. Without fantasy, that is to say, without understanding. The love was enough, because it's the love that moves the sun and the other stars, the whole caboodle.
You've gone all the way to the end of the poem, and I'm still sitting in Inferno here.
I'm saying
Yes.
you can't read it as a single sequence, one thing after another, each making sense in its own right.
Well, I understand it, but I'm thinking again about the particular poetic devices, if you will, that he uses. For example, there's darkness, and it gets darker. Everything is static. These are ideal types of gluttony and lust and the rest, but they're condemned to doing the same thing. There's no movement forward. There's just that defining sin. Yeah. And then you get down to Satan, and he can't even move. And he can't make any sound. He can't do anything. There's nothing. That's a definition in a sense of nothing. There's stasis there. Right. And then when you get to the Purgatorio, first of all, the color green comes on, and you have movement, and you have hope. So not being able to move and being able to move is, in one sense, how he defines hope, it seems to me, in the poem. Let's turn to another fascinating issue you raised, the relationship between the Dante who writes the Commedia and the Dante who is the poem's protagonist, or as you put it, Dante the narrator and Dante the narrated. In several important respects, you write, the two are one and the same. I'm not altogether clear on this. For example, you write that at the end of the Purgatorio, it becomes clear that in his journey through hell, Dante was by no means a tourist. In going through hell, he was really going through hell. Quote, end of quote. In what sense was Dante the author not just a tourist in hell, even though Dante the protagonist is clearly not confined to hell?
Self-knowledge. I think that's it. I mean, your self-knowledge, I mean, at its worst, your self-knowledge is that of a psychopath. It's an illness at its worst. And that's terrible deformation of self-knowledge. That's hell. Yeah? But there's a good self-knowledge, which is as truthful. Indeed, it is more truthful. I think it's what Dante, in the end, has to say, is that grinding, self-destructive self-knowledge is untrue. And it creates a world of untruth around it. That's hell. The world of untruth around this damaged self-knowledge, which is basically an illness. He doesn't talk in those terms. You don't talk about therapy in the 13th, 14th centuries in the way in which we do. Yeah, quite so. But you do have a certain sense of evil as psychopathic, because all the doctrines of vice in that period, that's to say, long-term evil practice, where basically that's your way of setting about things, the stuff that you've just got used to doing, and whether or not it's good or bad, you just get on with it, because that's what happens in hell. Whether or not it's good or bad, I'm sticking with it, is hell. Yeah? That's the bit on our side that accounts for our being there. We don't want to move away from that, yeah? And yet we do, because we know our wants are fabricious wants, they're nonsense wants. And what's worse is you're now stuck with them. That's the hardest part to accept. You're stuck with this. There's no way out. no exit here. Yeah? Now, that, I think, is a psychology of evil which Dante invents, and it's phenomenally acute. I don't think Jean-Paul Sartre, who prouded himself on how good he was about evil, is even a fraction as good as Dante is on this. He doesn't get the psychology of it. He doesn't get that entrapment, which is the sense of, I'm unable to deal with my own evil. I can't get beyond it, and I don't want to get beyond it because I don't see any way out of this whatsoever. That entrapment in evil is, basically there's no way out, there's no exit. And by the way, no exit is Jean-Paul Sartre's talk about, which is why I introduced his name, not irrelevantly in this connection, because he's trying to explain what hell is like. Enfer, c'est les autres. Other people are hell, says Sartre. And hell is the place where other people are, they constitute your hell because you can't relate to them. So I think all that is, you need a poem that long. You need 34 cantos, there, and 33 is the normal number. Yeah? He's got a 34th. He kind of gets it. Unless you get this, you don't realize what the problem is to which the writing of this commedia is in some way a sort of solution, though solution is a terribly weak word.
Right. What I want
Sorry, I'm giving a lecture.
Yes. No, I want to focus this on a moment because you didn't quite get to it, which is to say, is it in the writing of the poem that he goes through hell and purgatory? You said the whole poem is purgatorial in nature. Is it in the writing of the poem, or do you think he went through it beforehand?
I think he was going through it and therefore wrote it in order to actually do it. Do you see what I mean? I think I wanted to try and get those two together in a certain kind of way. He's not just reporting.
The author and the protagonist.
Yeah,
we're
that's
talking
right.
about.
He is reporting, but he's reporting something other than just this narrative. He's reporting himself, right? I think, in that sense, also, I think for the reader, it's an invitation for you to do the same. Do you see what I mean?
Save that for my last question. I want to get back to that. I want to get back to that to a moment. On this point, a matter of biography. If he had not been exiled from Florence, and I don't think, well, I think there's a lot of Chicagoans here. I'm not one by background. I'm a recent arrival here. There is such a profound love of an attachment for Florence. And he's exiled. He can't come back under threat of death. Would he have written the comedy, do you think, the Commedia, if he hadn't been exiled?
There's no evidence that he was thinking of it before 1308. He's exiled then by 1302, so it doesn't come from nowhere, but I think it comes from that experience of exile. And I think that it's that sense, is being deracinated, uprooted. Yeah? And he longs for those roots. And he discovers that, to use a posh word theologians use, that the rediscovery of those roots is an eschatological thing. That is to say, it's got to be achieved in the long run. But the point about eschatology is that it's not about the long run, it's about the real now. Because the real now is only understood in terms of the long run. And so I think that's why I put those two together, do you see what I mean? It's both a narrative which goes from beginning to end. It has a sequence, but you have to have been at the end in order to be able to write that beginning. You couldn't have written Inferno if you hadn't got Paradiso in mind.
Yes, as Eliot says, in the end is my beginning, and now I know what Eliot meant.
Do you know
Thank you.
quartets, Eliot's four quartets? They're very consciously related to Dante, and Eliot's whole poetics is related to
Would
Dante.
you
Not always terribly well, but I mean, I think it's hugely important to him. So yes.
Since you brought up comparative literature, would you say that Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses, is related? Yeah. I mean, the children and grandchildren of Dante are myriad. Let's turn to the Purgatorio. The eminent medieval historian Jacques Le Goff has hailed the Purgatorio as, quote, the noblest representation of purgatory ever conceived by the mind of man, end of quote. I'm sure you're familiar with that. In that representation, as you point out, Dante adds theological dimensions not found in traditional textbooks about purgatory. For example, as Dante moves up the mountain of purgatory, he doesn't merely endure a painful personal purgation of the 7 deadly sins. He is propelled upward by a growing desire for God, which is something far more significant. That changes conventional understandings of purgatory, does it not?
Yeah, I think Purgatorio 27 is crucial here, because at Purgatorio 27, Dante has been through this purgation of the 7 deadly sins, step by step, and he's got through to the end of them, and he thinks he's there, and he gets a terrible message from Beatrice, who says, sorry, mate, you haven't even started. Yeah? And those last cantos of Purgatorio are absolutely critical, because he suddenly realizes that just overcoming sins isn't the point. There's a conversion needed here which is much more radical than just being morally complete.
You anticipated one of my questions.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, she does come on like a fishwife in a way, doesn't she? I mean, he's been waiting to see her and waiting to see her.
Yeah.
And then when he gets, when she shows up finally in the poem,
She's
she's a
savage.
scold.
Yeah.
Yes. But there's a point here that before we get back to Beatrice for a moment, and it's that I want to bring up. At the end of his ascent, right where you're talking about, Dante does not find himself in heaven. He has only returned to the condition of innocence enjoyed by Adam and Eve before the fall, which is as far as Virgil, a virtuous pagan, can take him. Now this, I'm given to understand from your book, is a Dantean innovation that you don't find in traditional accounts of purgatory, right? He's been brought back to the condition of Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not enough, but yes.
I think that's right, but I need to add something else. The notion of the Purgatorio predates Dante by a long short. Well, it predates Dante by Origen. We're going back to the 1st, 2nd century. Yeah? The idea of purgatory, of a purgation required, is there. I think what you're right in pointing out is that Dante gives a whole lot of sort of gloss to what's involved precisely in purgatory. He spells it out. It becomes a long narrative of the basically the spiritual life. Put it this in another way. Dante's Purgatorio is a narratival version of something which you immediately recognize in St. John of the Cross, for example. It's all there in John of the Cross. Read The Dark Night of the Soul, for goodness sake.
John of the Cross is what century?
He's 16th century, so we're talking 3 centuries later. And John of the Cross isn't getting this from Dante. He's getting it from independent sources of the kind that Dante was getting it. So I think that yes, Dante narrates purgatory in a way that doctrinal writing doesn't do, But John of the Cross narrates purgatory in detail. This is what it's like. This is what you will feel. This is how it will seem to you in this place. This is John of the Cross. So he's writing not in that narratival kind of way, but he's a poet, and he's glossing his own poem, in Una noche oscura. One dark night I went out, is how that poem begins. So they're part of a doctrinal, ascetical, spiritual development that's working its way through those traditions. And part of my general mission with Dante is to restore Dante to the theological history of these things. And this dismissal of him by two sides. Dante is remarkably dismissed. He's dismissed as theologian by the poets, and he's dismissed as poet by the theologians.
May I interrupt you for a moment? You are neither a theologian nor a poet. You're a philosopher, and you've got...
Oh, I'm not a poet. I can write really bad limericks, but that's it.
Yes. So this is what I like about it. But of course you know your theology. Of course you do. So the point is, again, academic compartmentalization is being overcome. I want to stick with the 16th century for a moment, because the Protestant reformers reject the idea of purgatory altogether, in part because it's not scriptural, in part because it made possible the sale of indulgences and all of that, and in part because it could be understood as salvation by works. And yet, and here I want to get back to the appearance of Beatrice.
Yes.
Yet, Dante, in writing 3 centuries earlier, makes it abundantly clear that it is only through grace alone that the virtues infused by it, that we can be saved. It's only through grace that we can be saved, through grace and through the virtues that grace brings with it. So it seems to me that's quite clear.
That seems absolutely right, and that contextualizes what I was saying a little bit earlier, and that is that you've got to get purgatory back into the picture here, one way or another. And to eliminate it is to eliminate the whole business of the narratival, the narratival character of spiritual development. That this is a long story. And it also, I think, ignores what I was saying about the end of Purgatorio, where Dante thinks he's made it precisely because he thinks good works is going to do it for him. And with Purgatorio 27, Canto 27, she appears to him at last, only to scold him for having made that fundamental mistake of thinking that good works would hack it. Sorry, hack it's an English word. Get it or something.
I wonder why Luther never invokes Dante in this regard, salvation by faith alone.
Well, you see, Dante is saying it isn't by faith alone because Dante thinks it is, and this is where Beatrice says to him, "Listen, you haven't even started. You haven't started the real thing. The real thing is a conversion, and you've just got to be utterly passive. Only grace can work this through you, and it will." So long as you don't get in the way, and you're getting in the way precisely by thinking that you've achieved something here on your own, that you've set your house in order and all should be well. Why can't I go straight into paradise? Well, Beatrice says, because you haven't even begun to understand what this has been about. You needed, yes, to dispose yourself to be available to the work of grace, but only grace can do this for you. And in fact, this is where you have to reread every bit of the whole of the Commedia in light of what comes after it. As you go along, you're rereading what you've just read. Do you see what I mean? You have to. And there's key episodes, and this is one of them, the one you've picked up. This is the key episode where you think you've got the story, and you're told, no, you haven't even begun to understand how this works. Yeah?
In other words, what comes later requires you to revise your understanding of what you've already read. It suddenly is seen in a new light. You know, I'm just thinking, we've had a vogue over the last couple of decades of journal writing, and we've also had something called narrative theology. And so the sense of my story, what is my story, or if serious journal writing, I've never done it, but if you're writing for a living, you're probably already doing something like that. You're looking over your life, and you're revising your story as you go along. And if you did it 20 years ago, and 20 years later you look back over what you wrote, there's a little of that in Dante. Toward the end of your book, you write that if you are to understand the Commedia and the ethical demands it makes on the reader, we must accept hell, purgatory, and heaven as real places, if only by willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
Why is that? Some people are going to have a problem with hell. Some people, as they say, they have no conception of heaven other than, which we'll get to in a moment. And they don't accept purgatory. But why must we, at least for the duration of reading the poem, accept these as real places? And what do you mean by real places?
I think what I mean by real places is something which Dante makes it very, very clear in all sorts of different ways, and that is that these places are communities. Hell is a pseudo-community. We all know pseudo-communities. We live in pseudo-communities. Yeah? Communities which have absolutely no foundation in what we belong to those communities in order to achieve, which lack the necessary conditions. We know that. We know about the inadequacy of communities. And they can be hell. Yeah? And hell is only hell because it's a community which exists by way of isolating people. And that's what makes it an anti-community. It actually creates isolation. So hell doesn't exist in order to represent individuality. I kind of hear this sometimes from students. But in hell, people are choosing, and you are on your own, aren't you? And Dante say, no, you are not. You live in worlds. Your individualism is a decreation of community, and that's how you live community, decreate it. And that's hell. And purgatory is the place where the community assists you to overcome. Do you notice how if you read Purgatorio, it's always crowds of people in particular places. It's always, you're never on your own. There are always these people who, all of whom are carrying sacks on their backs in long lines, you know, or doing something else, but they're all always doing it together. Purgatory is the beginning to restore people back to the community to which they essentially belong, the place where they are essentially themselves only because they live in this community. And that notion that somehow or other you could be essentially yourself precisely by distancing yourself from community, Dante says, yes, that's called Inferno. That's called hell. And there are plenty of political ideologies which are based precisely on Dante's notion of hell. So there's a politics here at every single point, and Dante knows this. One of the things which annoys a lot of people about Dante is that he sees the Commedia, this great work of theology, of ascetical theology, of mysticism, whatever you call it, is actually also an intervention in nasty Italian politics. And Dante is personally quite nasty. Yeah? He's not a saint. Yeah? So he kind of understands this world of the damage that you do to yourself precisely by these anti-communities, which are basically Inferno.
Okay. So, in other words, an individualistic interpretation of the journey he takes would be absolutely wrong. Dante is very much obviously the communitarian, in the sense that Catholicism is certainly communitarian. Paradise is certainly one subject that requires poetry to come to the aid of theology. According to repeated surveys, most people think of heaven, if they think about heaven at all, as a place where they will see God face to face and reconnect with family and friends, though not necessarily in that order. Heaven, being eternal, seems static, same old, same old. How does Dante subvert this sense of heaven of more than just of more and more of the same thing, the static nature?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you understand hell in the way in which I just explained for Dante, then you understand heaven as precisely the opposite of that it is community. But the poetics of community are so much harder to write than the poetics of anti-community. And I think most people feel that sense of disappointment about Dante's Paradiso, that it doesn't fill in the picture of this wonderful community where what? What's the answer to that? What's the community like there? My will was moved by love, the love which
moves
the sun and the other stars. That's how it ends, and he's pointing to. Listen, there's a. Sorry to use this terrible word. There's a cosmology there. There's a sense of what the world will be like, what a universe would be like. And he's trying to get you to understand this is so much bigger than you just getting a few happy kicks out of life, which is actually very, very quickly is indistinguishable from hell. It's very, very hard to give an account of heaven which isn't also an account of hell. Very difficult indeed. And if you think of this as a failure on Dante's part, then it's the right failure. You ought to fail here, because anything you could actually give an account of, which would spell out what heaven would be really like, couldn't be heaven because you couldn't spell it out. Do you see what I mean? There's a certain kind of, to use that other very ugly Greek word, apophaticism here, a sense of you can't speak here. And that's what Dante does in the end. He says, read that last canto of Paradiso. It has a beautiful beginning with the Virgin Mary. Yeah? And it begins with a wonderful paradox. O Virgin Mother, daughter of your Son. This is telling you already, we've lost track of language here. We can't hack it. Sorry, I keep on using that word. I don't know why, but showing that language fails here removes you from any possibility that you'll say something really, really stupid, because you will.
So it's a silence. There was a silence in hell. There was a silence around Satan.
And Purgatory is language in between two silences. Purgatory is the poetics of how to speak, given that it's not hell, but it's not yet heaven. Right?
Yes.
That's where we are. This is why Purgatorio is so central. Actually, Purgatorio is describing the world of the reader who's reading the whole of the comedy. Do you see what I mean? We're purgatorial people. And only purgatorial people write poetry. Because in hell, there's no possibility of poetry. And in heaven, even poetry ceases. Do you see? There is no poetics at the end. Poetry, even poetry. Here, high fantasy, alta fantasia. this fails, and my will was moved by love, the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Now, that's a theme of a lot of 14th century theology, and this is where you get Dante siding theologically with the position which Aquinas, for example, constantly tried to resist, the idea that somehow or other intellect disappears and will takes over. And Aquinas is saying, hang on, there's a thing called intellectual love too. Intellect is a loving, is a kind of loving.
Well, that brings you back to something you stress in there. I want to bring up with you, say that Dante is in heaven, but only as a pilgrim.
Yeah.
But he's also there as a learner.
Yeah.
And as opposed to nothing more to be learned in hell, I've already defined myself. As I read what you're writing, heaven is, and this is going to sound very prosaic, you're there as a learner. It's infinite learning.
Yeah.
So the static nature disappears because it's not learning out of a book, obviously, and so the intellect is gratified there. But the idea of infinite learning is very difficult for us to grasp. I like the idea myself. I wouldn't have books at home if I didn't.
Well, right. I wouldn't be in a university if I didn't believe that. I mean, the idea that somehow or other you learn, and then when you've learned it, you stop, is nonsense. It's just a failure to understand anything about learning. Because if it's learning, then it doesn't stop. It can't. Yeah? Unless you just have self-stopping stuff. Like, I mean, I can learn, I suppose, I never did, enough arithmetic to be able to do Fermat's last theorem or something. I think I understand what Fermat's last theorem is about, but not very much. I gave up mathematics at the age of 14. I mean, I did, and I've never learned since. So yes, I mean, I can go on learning mathematics, but no, I mean, you see, what Dante is talking about here is inconceivable. We don't have the conceptual equipment to be able to handle this. But what he's saying is, look at Dante. He's in heaven. He's learning. He's constantly learning. But also, he's with people who are teaching him. Teaching and learning is precisely the mechanism which gives you the dynamic of heaven. In Dante, it's all about that. And they're all teachers. They're instructing Dante and saying, listen, if you want to understand heaven, then understand this is what we do here. We talk in this with each other in this way, which goes way beyond your capacity to understand, because you don't even understand what it takes to move step by step within this infinity of learning. And if you don't understand learning as an infinity, here and now, then I don't think you understand learning.
All right, let me step in here. We have one
Sorry, I'm
last
getting enthusiastic.
last question. Yes. At one point, you described the Commedia as, quote, a coherent story, the telling of which amounts to a call to the conversion of intellect and will, made by the summons of an ultimate love. That's a mouthful. A coherent story, the telling of which amounts to a call to the conversion of intellect and will, made by the summons of an ultimate love. Of course, the love begins with the love of Beatrice, and it ends with the love of God. Might we regard the reading of the poem as a profound spiritual experience that can change one's life in a way that reading, say, Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained would not?
Yeah.
Is there something about Dante, in other words, that I'm thinking of a roughly parallel poem, roughly with the work of Milton's. Is there something about what Dante does with poetry as a theologian that would make it every bit the equivalent, oh, let's be mundane, a Jesuit retreat for a month or something like that. If one attends to the text, is it possible that one is transformed in the writing, in the reading of it?
Well, Dante's answer to your question would be yes, there is. And the reason I say that is that at one point in one of his prose writings, he says, you have to read my poem according to the four senses. Right? Now, what does he mean by the four senses? The four senses, they go back in the Latin Christian tradition to Gregory the Great in the 5th, 6th century. Okay? They go back earlier than that into Origen in the Greek tradition in the 2nd century. And it's a doctrine according to which the text of Scripture operates at four distinct semantic levels. It has a literal sense, it has an allegorical sense, it has an anagogical, mystical sense, and it has a moral sense. And you've got to read every text of Scripture according to the four senses, because this is how the Spirit speaks. And by the Spirit, it means the Holy Spirit, the second person of the Trinity, the third person of the Trinity, second person of the Trinity, who brings together Father and Son. And Dante is often almost derided for having implicitly made the claim that his poem needs to be read according to the four senses of Scripture. That's the reason why you have to say, if you're to take that seriously, you have to read this text theologically. Because otherwise you can't make sense of it. The senses of it are the theological senses according to which you have to read Scripture. And that fantastic claim that what you need to do in order to read this poem properly is to read it as if it were Scripture.
I'm going to leave it at that for a moment because we're going to have some questions.
Yeah.
Dennis, you may not be a theologian, but you've written theology of a very high order, and I think it's obvious. I thank you for it, and I thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So since we're in this middle space between the two silences in which we can use language, we have time for question and answer. But at the same time, LCI staff will be bringing around surveys. So while you're listening to the Q&A, if you could please fill out a survey for us, because this lets us know what we did well and what we could improve, because we love doing this kind of event, so we want to do it as best we can. Now, I misspoke earlier when I said that there would be a microphone for me to carry around and have you use to ask your question, which means that I'm duly punished by having to repeat your question, summarize it up here so that everyone can hear it. So, if you do have a question, raise your hand, ask it, I'll repeat it, and then we'll turn it over to the experts. Madonna, take us away.
Yes, fascinating interview. Thank you so much. And it's delightful to listen to your posh accent. You know, I was reading the beginning of your book, and what came to mind was something that George Weigel said when he was commenting on the Theology of the Body lectures of John Paul II about the complementary gifts of men and women. And George Weigel said that those series of lectures over the centuries would cause us to rethink every article of the Creed. So that was fascinating. I got the impression there at the beginning of the book that you were suggesting that Dante's contribution as a poet to theology is somewhat akin to the way a woman, you mentioned Juliana Gorsuch or Hildegard of Bingen, would do theology. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I mean, he's doing...
So maybe I'll just, so that everyone can hear, what would the question, it's a question on Dante's feminine poetry?
Yeah, women and poetry, yeah. I mean, who's the inspiration? Beatrice. That's where it comes from. And I think that's easily forgotten because you just read the poem and Beatrice doesn't appear in it, yeah, until the very end. Yeah. But the point is that it's where the poem comes from is Dante's relationship with Beatrice, with whom he fell in love at the age of 12 and never saw her again. So he's kind of recollecting what does this woman mean to me? And if I'm going to answer that question, I have to write this poem. Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Then I'll be able to understand what Beatrice has meant to me. Yeah? And I can't think of a stronger sense of stronger non-sentimental sense of a tribute to a woman written by a man in the course of a literary text. It's saying, no, it was my relationship with this woman that underlies the significance of this text. And so, I don't know, it's an interesting question you ask. I'm not quite sure why you asked it. I'd be very interested to know why you thought this question was important. But the answer is it is important, but it's very interesting to know why you thought it was.
Well, I think it was because you repeatedly mentioned that there were women doing theology at the time of Thomas Aquinas, but they were doing it very differently.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
In a more poetic.
Yeah.
Dennis, you have just placed a very heavy burden on every husband in this room.
Yeah, but I mean, I think...
They can just buy a copy of the book.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes, you could always do that.
That's it.
But yes, I mean, of the books that I've written, one of them was about Julian of Norwich, precisely in that same period, a bit later, but not much. Almost a contemporary of Dante's. She knows nothing of Dante, of course, but that sense, and of course she's not the only woman writing in that period. There are also famously heretical women, in that period. So the whole caboodle is done by women. And actually, you see, the Middle Ages, for all that one looks back at the Middle Ages and say, oh, goodness gracious, did anything happen there? There are much, much more effective women writers in the Middle Ages than there are in the 20th century when it comes to this work. I mean, Catherine of Siena, Julian of Norwich, yeah, Margaret...
Bertino?
Yeah.
He says in the beginning of his book that he's going to make room for the poet as a theologian, as previously in your book on Julian of Norwich, he made room for women who wrote in a different way. They don't sound like Thomas Aquinas.
They don't.
It's a very different form, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let me see if we have, do we have a second question? Mary Jo.
Yeah.
Just on the idea of the life of learning,
Yeah.
is that part of the ascent, perhaps?
Yeah.
Is the life of learning part of the ascent, is the question.
Ascent, and so you were saying,
Yes.
I heard you right, getting to Paradiso or
Yeah.
never leaving hell,
Yeah.
nihilism, there's no learning there, but this Paradiso that we
Yeah. Well, I don't know. You see, like most people, heaven is very hard to imagine. And it's actually, if you don't imagine it in some way or other, it very quickly becomes a very disagreeable place. And so one of the ways in which you correct those false impressions, which in effect reduce heaven to a sort of moderated hell, is by understanding it as endlessly learning. And now listen, I'm an academic. I spend my life explicitly, formally in the business of learning. For me, it never ends, right? I keep on trying to retire and I keep on non-retiring. Why? Because it goes on and on and on, which for me, you see, I don't have a difficulty finding a model in my own experience of life for something which is endlessly improving, yeah?
Well,
endlessly better. So I'm not saying I am any good at it. I'm saying that's what it's about, and my failures are judged precisely by that standard. In other words, becoming boring is hell, essentially. Yeah. Isn't
Now
it?
I see Douglas and I see Anne, but between the two of them, I would very much like a University of Chicago student to ask a question, so I won't demand it. But if any of you have a question, it'll come after Douglas's. Douglas?
Yeah.
the Inferno and Hell being a deformation, and then you're less specific about the other kind of a good self-knowledge. I take it maybe the dichotomy is Paradiso would be the good self-knowledge.
Yeah.
Is there something different in between?
Yeah.
Purgatory represent self-knowledge that's not deformed, but it's just more subtle than a purgatoration process, but at the same time, still kind of self-knowledge.
It's absolutely crucial, this. I mean, immediately you started saying, raising that question, I thought, I did my doctoral dissertation on self-deception. It's a very interesting topic as how you can lie to yourself. How can you lie to yourself? You're both the liar and the lied to. You must know what's going on, yeah? But you can. All you need to do is to get really, really unimaginative and humdrum, and stay humdrum, not asking questions about yourself, not interrogating yourself. But then you read, this is where you see Jean-Paul Sartre meant quite a lot to me. When writing about precisely this notion of bad faith, mauvaise foi, living in bad faith, living a lie, and knowing that you're living a lie, but suppressing your knowledge that you're living a lie. That play of knowing and not knowing, and carefully guided, knowing the right things, admitting enough, but not too much, so forgetting to notice this, that, or the other, which your wife or your friends were very happy to inform you about, and you're very good at resisting the information. And that pattern of knowing and not knowing, in and out of truth and falsity and self-deception, and that you do need purgatory. You really, really need purgatory to get past that. Do you see what I mean? You don't want to die in that condition because you're unresolved. Yeah? But what purgatory does is resolve you into your own truth, right? And that's hard. It's what you didn't want to accept. Do you see what I mean? There's a whole sort of moral theology going on here. And you see, it's one of the ways in which it seems to me you can read the Commedia as a kind of narration of a moral theology. Do you see what I mean? And Thomas Aquinas writes the moral theology book. Do you see what I mean? He's no poet. He tries. And we still sing some of his hymns, but they're pretty doggerel Latin, to be honest. But he doesn't really have that, do you see? I mean, he doesn't do it that way. But he spells it out prosaically, and it's stunningly good, incredibly informative and insightful. But he's no poet. And Dante does it in another way. You kind of recognize yourself over and over again in Dante, in Purgatorio. You see yourself, damn it, he's reminded, I didn't want to know. So it is an intervention which is meant, I think, which is an intervention to a moral purpose. And I think this is one of the reasons why it seems to me important to read Dante as a theologian and restore him into the world of theology. Partly in order to represent theology more adequately, precisely through this narratival poetic construction, but partly just simply to recover from the idea that you can write poetry to no moral purpose. Yeah? And Dante, you see, he bundles away all those dichotomies that we work with. Oh, it's poetry rather than theology, or theology rather than poetry. We don't often say that because we sound foolish if we uttered it, but we often think that.
Do we have a U of C student? Francesco, is that a hand?
Sure. I guess I was wondering, this probably wouldn't be as relevant to the specific, medieval period, but you've been talking a lot about the distinction between, poetry and prose theology.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a distinction between what poetry and prose fiction can accomplish?
I wouldn't want to make too fast a distinction. I mean, you sometimes would want to distinguish between them because a writer makes you want to distinguish them. But I don't think you should impose the distinction. Do you see what I mean? Allow the writer to find his or her own feet in their own way, in their own mixes, in their own complexities. And you see, one of the things I mean, I love universities, but they do a lot of damage. And one of the damage that they do, is compartmentalization, or this setting up of distinct territories and jealously guarded and boundaries firmly policed. Yeah. I've spent 68 years in universities altogether. And I can tell you, policing boundaries is one of the really, really dangerous things that goes on in universities. And they are responsible for damage which nobody else would have done. It's only universities who do this damage. They have a lot to accept responsibility for.
Let me respond more directly to what you're saying. The highest form of literature is poetry, the most concentrated. The weight that's put on the individual word. Why this one word rather than another? Why the sound of the word? Why the shape of the word, as well as the denotations and connotations of the word? Writing, you see some of this in Updike, but it's so concentrated, and each word has to, as it fits in with other words, evoke so much more. You have to pull more out of the word, out of the language, you see. That's different than prose. Prose has to have a narrative. It has to set a lot of things up. I see very different. I'm a journalist. Yeah, I write books, but they're prose. And when people tell me, gee, I want to be a journalist, although today there's no jobs, opinion, yes, but journalism, no. I tell them, don't read don't read poetry.
Yeah.
Read poetry, get the language in you. It's easy. Anybody can, with discipline, can learn how to report, and you think there'd be more of it, more than there is. But poetry is the essence, and so there's a matter of suggestion of moreness. That's what I'm getting
Yes,
at
that's absolutely
in poetry.
right. Yeah.
And that's where I would make the distinction of reading a Dante versus an Aquinas, for example. There's suggestion of more, and that's why I would think that poetry belongs in, especially in Paradise, because there's that suggestion of more, before which, as you say, you have to be silent.
Yeah, I think that it's the quality of the silences. I mean, that's why I said you've got these two silences, and poetry is in the space between them, and it's getting you from one to the other, from the silence of hell, which creates a very interesting proposition about what Dante's poetry is doing, describing hell. He's kind of on the inside of hell, and he tells you, in Canto, I can't remember which, towards the end of Inferno, he says, had I the language which was foul enough to describe what was going on here, then I would be able to give you an account of it. But since I'm a poet, I haven't got it. I haven't got the language foul enough to get the truth of hell across to you. Yeah? Why? Because hell exists precisely as the absence of meaning, or absence of truth, absence of the possibility of poetry. And that poetic act of sort of self-confession, here, poetry fails utterly because hell excludes the possibility of poetry. And then look at Canto 31 of Paradiso, where poetry fails, but in an utterly different way, totally different notion of failure. This is a glorious, wonderful failure, which means that poetry has now led you to a point where there's no end. This goes on forever. Has to. You can't put an end to this. We know what puts an end to poetry. The only thing that puts an end to poetry is hell.
Can I end with one terrible
Right at time.
thought, which is that mentioning Beatrice, and they met with, he was 12 years old and he falls in love. I have not been able to stop thinking of a song. Thank heaven for little girls.
Well, we know it's a great event when we have more questions than we have time for. So, Anne, I apologize. Yeah, we can ask it. Excellent. So, our speakers will not go anywhere right away. There's the opportunity for a couple of more private questions. But I have to say, I thought that I could see all of you smiling when I was in the back of the room and staring at the back of your heads. I thought I saw smiles there, but the opportunity to come up here and watch your faces as these two are answering the questions made me realize how worthwhile an event this was. So if you could, with me, thank these two speakers once again.
Thank you.